Session 42 on human Earth system interactions. So this session is sort of, by its nature, quite broad, quite diverse. Those sort of like missing interactions between the Earth system and the sort of human component of scenarios as well. So this was sort of inspired a little bit from a Aspen Global Change meeting we had last year, and it's good to see this community developing and expanding. And we have sort of 5 sort of really interesting talks this afternoon, hopefully some time at the end for discussion. Should also point out as well, we had some absolutely excellent submissions to this session, and we didn't have room for all of them. So please do check out the online posters to the session as well. We have about 7 or 8 of those. So the first video is from Kaoru Tachiiri, who's joining us from Japan. So he has a video, and we'll start with this one, and hopefully things will work as follows. So can we, yeah.
I'm Carlo Tachiiri of Japan Agency of Marine Earth Science and Technology, JAMSTEC. Today I will talk on our attempt to couple Earth system model and socio-economic model. Here is the background. There is an existing model coupling human and Earth system, integrated Earth system model, IIASA, developed in 2015. And this paper by Uda et al. In 2018 indicates that the climate-human carbon cycle feedback may be comparable to climate-natural carbon cycle feedback. And for that topic, we had a workshop titled Linking Human and Earth System Models for Global Change Analysis last year. Like that, the human-Earth system interaction is becoming a hot topic. For this topic, we have been working with a step-by-step approach. First step was inputting emission pathway derived by EMIC, our system model, or intermediate complexity, to a CGE, computable general equilibrium model. We published 2 papers on that. Another work is developing a scenario using a CGE and input that to an Earth system model, and then assess the basic impact indicators such as Arctic sea ice and Pacific sea level rise, coral reef, etc. This paper was cited by all of Working Group 1, 2, 3's recent assessment report of IPCC. And then we proceeded to a 2-way approach. First such work was Kenichi Matsumoto's work in 2019, coupling his CGE and a simple climatic model with labor productivity. Then we replaced a simple climatic model with an EMIC in last year, also used labor productivity. In this work, we found almost linear decrease in GDP for warming with a rate of 2% GDP down per 1 degree Celsius warming. And then we got ready for 2-way coupling with the state-of-the-art Earth system model. Here is our ESM, MIROC ES2L, developed by our group at JAMSTEC in collaboration with NIES and the University of Tokyo. The equilibrium climate sensitivity of this model is 2.7 degrees, which is not so extreme, and transient climate response and TCR for cumulative carbon emission is also moderate. With this model, we participated in the many MIPs, including scenario MIP, C4 MIP, and ZEC MIP. Meanwhile, we did the review work of human Earth system feedback to identify key processes and sectors. Not surprisingly, land use or agriculture, labor productivity, and energy demand and supply are identified as important processes. Finance has potential of a big impact, but for considering that a general equilibrium model is not enough and a more sophisticated, like agent-based model, will be needed. And at present, this is out of scope of our model development. Then we confirmed that the labor productivity is good to start with, and it is important, and relatively easy to consider. The simple model we can use for experiment right now is something like this. We calculate labor productivity from the output of ESM and input it into the CGE. And in the output of the CGE, only the CO2 emissions are currently returned to the ESM. They are not fully coupled, but loosely coupled. Only once in 10 years, the data is exchanged with each other. In here, labor productivity is considered like this. For that, we refer to Lawson and Sartori's paper, in which workability or labor productivity is linearly going down with temperature beyond the threshold that are different for different sectors. The primary sector's workers are outside in longer hours and sensitive to the global warming, followed by the secondary sector, and then the tertiary sector. Here, the x-axis is a wet bulb globe temperature, WBGT, calculated from temperature and relative humidity. Temperature and relative humidity are taken from the ESM's hourly output, which is aggregated to regions with population weight. The results for the BAU scenario are as presented in the slides. Difference between coupling and non-coupling, which refers to the presence or absence of feedback to the economy, at 2100, when these differences becomes largest, the difference in emission was about 10%. And in CO2 concentration, the difference was about 30 ppm. For temperature, the difference is hidden in the ESM's large internal variability. But after smoothing, we found about 0.1 degree difference between coupled and uncoupled cases in the latter half of the century. This slide shows the spatial distribution of the difference. The upper left figure shows the labor productivity itself. Not surprisingly, hot and wet regions have relatively large decrease in labor productivity, and cold regions have no significant decrease in that. GDP also has the same tendency, and also in CO2 emissions. Note that the color is reversed only in this figure. For temperature, blue means cooling by considering LP feedback, and red means warming. The northern high latitude may have relatively large fluctuations, and relatively large warming is also found in southern Africa. However, to conclude whether or not this distribution is meaningful, we need further analysis, I think. Not shown here, but we also did an experiment with a mitigation scenario, which is modified from RCP 2.6 and resulted in slightly lower than 2 degree warming. In that experiment, emission is a constraint and not changed between coupled and uncoupled cases. And so concentration and temperature is also unchanged, but we found 1.5% GDP decrease in the coupled case. Next, we will also introduce a model we are preparing. What is new is couple agriculture and land use model in this part. At present, due to a technical problem, this part is also loosely coupled, in which climate and land use exchange their information once a year. The model used for that part is IROC Integrand, developed by Tokta Yokohata and colleagues. In the models, various submodels are coupled, including agriculture, water resource, and land use models. And agriculture and land use part is like this. Climate influences the crop yield calculated by agriculture model. And in each region, agriculture suitability index ASI is calculated from yield, price, wage, and slope. Crop hand is distributed in the order of ASI. And finally, supply-demand balance is kept by inter-region trades. Here, general equilibrium solution is found. And demand is given from socioeconomic model. We have a virtual poster presentation on this model by Tokta. So please visit that if you are interested and if the poster is still accessible. Currently, we are coupling IROC Integrand to incorporate land use related sectors, that is agriculture, livestock, and forestry. At present, we have a jump in land use starting the land use model, so we are fixing that now. The next process to incorporate will be energy demand by heating and cooling, for which we have developed a test code after literature review. So if land use problem is fixed, we will start testing that code. After that, we will examine if we have other processes or sectors to incorporate. At the same time, we have to expand to consider non-CO2 greenhouse gases and aerosols. This work has been supported by this project. And recently, a new 5-year project supported by Next has started, and we will be financially supported for another 5 years. To summarize the talk, after step-by-step progress, we are now trying ESM-CG coupling. We have developed a coupled ESM-CG exchanging CO2 and labor productivity. In BAU experiment, visible difference between coupled and non-coupled cases are observed. We have already coupled an agriculture land use model and now fixing a technical problem on land use. We will incorporate of human system in the Earth human system. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that, Kaoru. So I don't think, hopefully, if there are any questions for Kaoru, probably the best thing to do is to put them sort of online, either in the sort of session 42 group on IIASA Connect or on Kaoru's talk, and hopefully we'll be able to get the online speakers to join us for the discussion. So next, I'd like to invite Sibyl Ecker from Radboud University and IIASA.
But I think that's the old one. Can we have the new one?
Yeah, sure.
And should I speak to the mic all the time?
Please, yes.
Okay.
That's the new one you gave me.
I think so.
Just give me 5 seconds to go.
Okay, then you will turn it on. Okay, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Sibel Eker. I will talk about using simple integrated assessment models to explore human-Earth system interactions. I say simple, I think, yes, here is my cover page. I say simple integrated assessment models, and with that I mean highly aggregate models that are low in sectorial and geographic detail. And I like to have people in the models. That's why I mainly work on representation of social system in these simple integrated assessment models. And today, in line with that, my talk will first touch a little bit upon the modeling methodology I'm mainly using, and then we'll give examples from using one of such models that's called the Felix model. So to start with, I think, as you would know, and as mentioned yesterday in the plenary session about the history of scenarios, history of global modeling and scenarios, Limits to Growth was the first globally known global modeling study. The key conclusion when it was published in 1972 was that our population growth, food supply, and food supply, industrial output, population growth is finite. They will stagnate around 2020s and they will decline from then on. So now this is definitely not news, but at that time in 1972, it was a very striking message. Therefore, the book sold millions of copies all around the world. Limits to Growth was based on a model called World 3, which originates from the earlier work of Jay Forrester, who was the supervisor of the team. And Jay Forrester was a professor of management at MIT since 1950s, and when he was running a large research project for the US government, he was having these usual project management problems, and he invented a modeling method for himself to solve his own problems, and this modeling method was called system dynamics. Conceptually, system dynamics integrates basic elements of systems thinking. These are nonlinearities, delays, stocks and flows, and feedback loops, feedback mechanisms. Mathematically speaking, it's based on differential equations, hence time progresses continuously. Is my sound okay, by the way? To me, it sounds a bit awkward. Okay, great to hear. So Jay Forrester invented system dynamics, and that was the core of Limits to Growth study. So Limits to Growth and the world dynamics was praised all around the world, but at the same time, it was also heavily criticized when it was published. So one of the harshest critics was the person whose name is behind these black lines, and he said there is no single formulation in this model that's drawn by empirical studies. That was a very, very harsh critic, even an insult, and there were many, many papers at that time that that were published by this critique and the authors of the Limits to Growth and Jay Forrester himself. And this person, this harsh critic, was William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018 with his pioneering work on integrated assessment models and their use in designing climate policies. So Jay Forrester and his positivist philosophy of science definitely laid the ground of integrated assessment modeling based on cost effectiveness and market equilibrium. And it affected all the climate policies and international negotiations that we have seen in the last couple of decades. Global modeling with system dynamics, though, was limited to a few aggregate models. And in the last few years, I personally had the chance of working with two of these models. The first one is called En-ROADS, developed by Climate Interactive and MIT Sustainability Initiative. That's mainly used for outreach purposes, so you might have heard it in an outreach setting. And the other model is called Felix model that's developed at IIASA here in early 2010s, first to support Earth observations, literally a remote sensing project. Felix was composed of 8 sectors, starting with climate and carbon cycle. It has an embedded simple climate model itself, integrated with energy system, economy, population dynamics, and food and land use. In recent years, we made some additions to bring more detail to food and land use system with dietary changes, and we also extended the social part of it, with population and education representation. And Felix includes several feedbacks explicitly between these sectors. And I would like to give a few examples now from one of these feedbacks. And that's that the first example is going to be about dietary shifts. So dietary shifts, lowered consumption of red meat especially, is considered one of the most promising demand-side mitigation options. And when it is assessed in scenario studies, these scenarios often assume that meat consumption will decline by 50%, for example, by 2050, or everyone in the world is going to turn flexitarian. However, we don't know if this is feasible and if it is possible to reach that level of meat reduction. Therefore, it becomes important to go one step further and take the social and behavioral factors into account when designing behavioral change scenarios. We use the Felix model to take these social and behavioral factors into account in the case of dietary shifts. The conceptual model, the figure you see here, shows the 2 core feedback mechanisms that we took into account to represent the dietary shifts. I wish I had a pointer, but let's see. The first, the inner feedback loop shows that people change their behavior according to climate risk perception. So that's one of the key connections between the human systems and climate. As climate events are observed, people perceive this as a risk. According to that, there is a long chain of psychological factors of changing the attitudes, intentions, eventually behavior. But once they change their behavior, this results in emission reductions, and hopefully this results in reducing the expected mean temperature increase. With that, climate events are reduced, and this affects the climate risk perception again. This actually creates a negative feedback loops. Hopefully we will observe this, and at some point people will experience fewer climate events, not to perceive a high climate risk. So this feedback loop, one of the main feedback loops, was between the human and Earth systems. The other one was purely in social systems. The larger one represents the social transmission feedback. As there are more people who change their behavior, this will shift the social norm, and there will be even more people willing to change their behavior towards sustainable diets. So this was the conceptual representation of it. The actual model was at the population level, represented the population dynamics, distinguished between adopters and non-adopters of plant-based diets, and it took social heterogeneity into account in terms of gender, age, education level, and other additional factors, for example, GDP, that affects meat consumption heavily in developing countries. So the model was the first of its kind to integrate behavioral factors and the environmental factors. However, it had many uncertainties simply because there is no reliable data at the global level to quantify such behavioral factors. Therefore, we used this model in an exploratory fashion. We swept the uncertainty space by running tens of thousands of simulations. And the first thing we saw in the results is that it's possible to have scenarios, model-based scenarios, where the world population, where almost 50% of the world population becomes vegetarian by 2050. However, this is in very few cases, and in the majority of scenarios, only 20 to 25% of the world population follows a plant-based diet. The other conclusion was about the environmental impact of different population dynamics. So by having people, different population groups in the model, we could assign different dietary compositions to different population groups. By dietary composition, I mean a current average diet or a flexitarian diet, vegan diet, vegetarian diet. And the conclusion was that to reap the benefits in environmental factors such as agricultural emissions, fertilizer use, or cropland use, it is better to have a large fraction of the population following a modest diet like flexitarian rather than a small fraction of the population eating a very hardcore plant-based diet such as vegetarian or vegan. So shortly speaking, it's better to have a modest diet, modest plant-based diet, followed by a large fraction of the population. We also used this model to identify the most important factors for mainstreaming plant-based diets. This was based on computational analysis of scenario discovery and global sensitivity analysis, which I will not go into detail. The main conclusion was that it's not the climate risk perception or health risk perception, but the social norm factor, especially of the young population, that drives widespread dietary shifts. From a modeling perspective, having an aggregate simple model was key in our ability to run such analysis that requires a heavy computations, hundreds of thousands of simulations, which is not easy even with the high computational power we have in these days. So as I said before, if we are talking about social systems, we also need data on a global scale or on a large scale, and these days most of my work goes in that direction. However, on the modeling side, there are other examples where simple models can be useful. And one of these examples is in the context of sustainable development pathways. My colleague Enayat Muallemi, who is sitting there, has used the Felix model to identify sustainable development pathways. And here, what's useful was the breadth of the model, because the model allowed exploring this sustainability, the future pathways of sustainable development goals simultaneously. And Enayat gave a talk about this yesterday. I will not go into the detail, but one of the main conclusions there is that yes, in the short term, even under optimistic pathways such as green recovery, it is not easy. It's not easy to reach the sustainability targets by 2030. However, in the long term, even though goals become more ambitious, there is a higher chance of achieving them. From a modeling perspective, this means that the model is actually able to capture the nonlinearities, because what is not successful in the short term can work in the long term, even though goals become more ambitious. Another context, another example where simple models can be useful is in exploring social tipping dynamics. Social tipping is a new concept that has emerged in the last couple of years, and as opposed to climate tipping points, social tipping is a positive thing. The idea there is that social systems might also have thresholds that are that can lead to accelerated decarbonization once they are triggered, once they are crossed. There was a recent study published by Francis Moore and colleagues, and I think it was brilliant. For example, they showed that individual action, individual behavior change do not do much in terms of reducing carbon emissions by 2100. However, if individual action is coupled with a credibility loop, if it is coupled with strengthening public opinion about climate policies, then it can lead to tipping dynamics. So what you see here is the colors refer to the carbon emissions, but by 2100. And you see that as the strength of individual action and as the strength of credibility for climate, for policy support increases, we see a jump in the reduction of emissions. So But social tipping is not only about public opinion or individual action. The recent literature says that social tipping can occur in various socioeconomic systems covering energy, finance, education system, or information feedbacks. So my colleague Charlie Wilson and I took the initiative recently to delineate these feedback mechanisms that can lead to tipping dynamics. So with a group of experts in energy, finance, urban infrastructure, or social systems, we ran a participatory modeling study and tried to identify the feedback mechanisms that can lead to tipping within and between social systems. And this is the first step to explore these tipping mechanisms further in quantitative models like the Felix model that I showed to you earlier. If I sum up, so in this short presentation, I tried to show you how simple aggregate models can be used for various purposes. First of all, they are easy to expand in terms of the scope, therefore they allow capturing feedbacks and nonlinearities between human and Earth systems relatively easily. They are helpful in exploring uncertainties through their speed, scope, and accessibility. I didn't show these examples here, but they are also more accessible to be used by non-experts. They are more accessible to be used in interactive sessions. Therefore, they can enable stakeholder participation in scenario development. And I see much value in using simple integrated assessment models, even though they don't have the accuracy of large models for direct policy analysis. However, I see many synergies where simple models and large models can complement each other to cover the weaknesses of each other. So that's my opinion in the domain of integrated assessment modelings, and I'm also curious to hear how it works for Earth system models and for climate emulators. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siva. We probably have time for one quick question if there is one in the room. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. So presumably in your model, I'm thinking about the Dietary Shifts model, contains some implicit or explicit assumptions about the relative importance of the drivers of dietary shift. So have you compared those input assumptions to what came out of the model? So to what extent are you sure that what the ranking of the importance of the various drivers is actually just the result of the parameterizations that you put in versus the many model simulations that you ran?
I think this large uncertainty analysis that I showed to you, the large uncertainty analysis I showed to you is to some extent tackles this problem of prioritizing the factors, because we consider the large uncertainty space for each factor. So yes, the ranges we consider depend on the initial parameterization, but they are relatively large, and through the combination of different uncertainty parameters, having the uncertainty range tackles this prioritization issue to some extent. So, and at the end, what we saw is it wasn't about the actual parameters as exogenous factors, rather the feedback mechanisms that parameters are embedded in.
Okay, so thank you very much. So our next speaker is Thomas Gasser from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and I will try and get your talk up. And while we wait for this to appear, there's an announcement that the plenary session from this morning will now be held at 6:15 in Theatre Saal, which is the big room we were in yesterday.
Takes a bit of time.
Yeah. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Gasser, and I will be presenting about a recent work we've done here at IIASA with colleagues on integrating physical uncertainty into the DICE, Simple Integrated Assessment Model, both under cost-benefit and cost-effective paradigms through stochastic optimization. So, very quick reminder of what the DICE model is. It's a simple, stylized, integrated assessment model in which one maximizes welfare, but also has to spend some of the production to abate CO2 emissions to avoid future damage on the economy through climate change. At least that is the cost-benefit setup. The typical, another way of using it is to turn off damage and decide an arbitrary target, for instance, for global temperature change. And the link between CO2 emissions and damage happens through a physical module that represents the Earth system. And in DICE, it's a simple carbon climate model. So what we did, we took an updated version of DICE. We completely revamped the physical module. We replaced it with a model that is called Pathfinder, that is new, but is essentially a compilation of existing formulation. It's calibrated through Bayesian inference. It's simple enough that it remains compatible with optimization algorithms that are used with IAMs. It has a few global impacts. It's also invertible, so it can be driven by atmospheric CO2 and temperature pathways, and it will soon be open source. So I don't want to describe the model too much because I want to go into the stochastic optimization, but very briefly, the Bayesian calibration gives us a very, very nice estimate of physical uncertainty in the system. So we use as prior information calibration on CMIP6 complex models. Then we had a bunch of constraints like observations, assessments by the global carbon budget or assessment from the AR6, or a few extra bits of data from the literature, and we get a nice posterior distribution for all the physical parameters, also for the initial state variables, like the state variables in 2015, and this is a joint distribution, that is, we also have a correlation between all the parameters. So we get really a state-of-the-art calibration of the physical module. So how do we create robust climate policies here? How do we do this stochastic optimization? So first, we have this joint distribution for all the parameters and state variables. So we draw n possible states of the world within that distribution. So for instance, 1,000 states of the world. So what is typically done, or what is very natural for physicists to do, is to do a Monte Carlo analysis. So then you have 1,000 states of the world, and you would solve the DICE model. You would optimize and find a climate policy for each one, every single one of those states of the world. So you would obtain an ensemble of 1,000 climate policies. But of course, having 1,000 climate policies is not exactly easy to exploit afterwards. So the robust optimization, the stochastic optimization here, is to solve for one unique policy that is shared across the 1,000 states of the world. So we have to solve the 1,000 states of the world, what the implication of this one policy across the 1,000 states of the world simultaneously, so that we can anticipate what are the outcome of this one policy. So when we do the cost benefit, what we solve for is actually we maximize the expected welfare, so the average across the states of the world. When we do cost-effective targets, we simply add the constraint that a certain fraction of states of the world stay below whatever target we set, 2 degrees, for instance, and we turn off damage. So here are some quick results, a difference in the cost-benefit setup between Monte Carlo and what I call here robust, or stochastic optimization. On the left you have, so those are 3-time series. On the left you have global temperature change. In the center, CO2 emissions. And on the right is the carbon price. The dashed light line is the Monte Carlo ensemble, and the dark plain line is the robust case. And we can see that we have a much lower peak of temperature in the optimal, stochastically optimal setup than in the Monte Carlo ensemble, which of course is reached through like much faster CO2 emission decline, an earlier date of net zero emissions, and more net negative emissions as well, which of course ultimately is driven by a higher carbon price. And it's so immediately interesting to see that actually the carbon price of the robust case is above the 95th percentile of the Monte Carlo distribution. So what happens concretely here, because we want to maximize expected welfare and there is a decreasing marginal utility in the model and nonlinear damage, basically the bad states of the world are given a higher weight, essentially. So it just happens that we have to pull down the whole distribution much more than if the system was completely linear. If it was linear, we wouldn't see any difference. And as I said, we have a much higher carbon price, so we, and this increase in carbon price, so that's the price we have to pay to make sure, given the uncertainty, that we actually have, in this case, optimality. So this is what we call here precautionary premium. This is an insurance premium that we have to pay to, well, here to really, again, to optimize. I think an interesting feature here that we can see is that on the temperature curve, the first one, can see that the at least the median of the ensemble goes back to the pre-industrial level, or very close to the pre-industrial, actually, in about 300 years. So there's a really, this robust climate policy really strives to restore more or less the pre-industrial temperature. Of course, we can wonder whether that's realistic, but that's what the model does here. So if we move to a cost-effective 2-degree target, here the difference is, well, we still see, well, first what we see, if you look at the dashed line in the temperature time series, we see it's just completely stuck at 2 degrees because there's no incentive to go back in the typical Monte Carlo setup. But in the stochastic optimization, the temperature, the median here, peaks at 2 degrees, but then goes down. So this is because we have some states of the world that are warming much or, more slowly than the median. And so we have to then prevent those states of the world from peaking above the target. So then every time one is about to peak above, or to go above the 2-degree level, we have to pull down again a bit more, so we have to increase the negative emissions. So that's what we see in the center plot. And again, this implies a modest here premium on the carbon price, so we have to pay a bit more to make sure that the target is reached. So there's a bit too much information here, but that was for the online presentation. So just don't look at the left-hand side, just look at the center plot. This is a violin plot of the peak temperature. Of course, if we do cost-effective, we can decide different levels of confidence of reaching the targets. So what I showed before is just 50% chance of reaching the target, but we can decide we want to reach 2% with 95% chance, for instance, which is this darker brown. And of course, it will change the carbon price there. And what is interesting then is to compare those different levels of confidence in the robust setup to the Monte Carlo ensemble. And this is what we see on the right here. So on the right, the plain line, is the cumulative distribution of carbon prices in the Monte Carlo setup. So it goes from 0 to 1, and that's where the carbon price is in that ensemble. And then the markers, the plus markers, they show the robust carbon prices for different levels of confidence. And on a given horizontal line, the difference between the plain line and the marker is actually this insurance premium that we have to pay. So this is the difference between, well, this is the extra price we have to pay to make sure that we reach the target, given the uncertainty, our knowledge of the uncertainty in the system. And then what we did, really, we looked a bit at how this premium changes depending on, for instance, on different climate targets. So we repeated the exercise for 1.5 degree targets, but we also did it for other climate impact targets. We looked at a permafrost target that would be to limit permafrost thaw below 30% of the initial carbon pool. And we also did it for ocean acidification, so we want to limit ocean acidification. And in every case, we see this insurance premium, we see this increase in carbon price, and therefore, which also means more stringent scenarios, more difficult to reach. But we also see we also have a few interesting conclusions here. We see that we get a higher premium for more stringent targets, which also makes sense because we are closer to getting there. We get a higher premium for more uncertain targets. For this permafrost target, we have a huge uncertainty because this is a very poorly constrained system. And with this huge uncertainty, we get a much, much higher premium. This is this long arrow here above my head. And of course, we also get a higher premium for higher confidence levels. If we want to be more certain of reaching a given target, we have to pay even more because of the uncertainty in the system. So, conclusion here. So we developed first, and then we implemented this Pathfinder model that is a simple carbon climate model based on the latest physical science that is compatible with integrated assessment models. So we coupled it to DICE to properly account for physical uncertainty, that is using robust decision-making stochastic optimization. So this stochastic optimization leads to an increase in carbon price, at least during the earlier periods. And of course, this increase in carbon price means that we need earlier net zero emission if we want to account for uncertainty, and we also need, when we also have a lower remaining carbon budget. Another interesting feature that we can see across all those the stochastically optimal pathways is that they all require significant amount of net negative emissions. It would be what is optimal to do according to the model, and this really raises the question of how do we develop a global economy for net negative emission on the time scale of a few centuries. Thank you.
There's time for one question, if there is one, from the floor. Oh, this is so good. Yeah, I really like this. I guess the question. We cannot hear you online. Oh right, yeah. I guess my one question is also on these are optimal decisions given the climate uncertainty, but there's obviously uncertainty associated with our ability to produce the negative emissions as well. So how do we deal with that? These two things which are pooled on the policy side uncertainty and the climate side uncertainty.
Well, in principle, the framework can really be applied to also socioeconomic uncertainty. The thing is that the control variable in the optimization system is the only thing that is shared across all worlds. Yeah. So once you decide your control variable, and that's an extremely important decision in the setup, but here it's carbon price. You can add any sort of uncertainty there that you can sample through whatever you want, and then you can combine the physical and the socioeconomic uncertainty, and you will still get an optimal pathway there, because you just get, I didn't insist on it, but there's no uncertainty range on the decision variable. The carbon price doesn't have uncertainty bar. It's unique. It's the one that you should decide given the uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so thank you, Thomas. So our next speaker is Peter Alexander from Edinburgh University. And let me just hand this back.
No, you can keep it otherwise if you want.
I'll let you do it.
Yeah, because it's not here. Right, is this the moment? Just check it for a moment, please.
Yeah, it looks good. It looks good. It's got this sort of silly face. It's probably a mistake. Yeah, it's cool.
It does. That's right. Sure. Okay. Then I will give up my hand when you can start.
Yeah, great, thanks. Hello. Great. So I'm Peter Alexander. I'm going to be talking to you today about the Lansing Model, which is a model of a food system at a global scale. So if you were expecting this Peter Alexander for the German-speaking amongst us, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you've got me instead. I wish I had his hair, maybe many other things, but sadly not. This is a model that we've been working on for a few years. I think we started in 2014 and was a collaboration between the Carlo Institute of Technology and the University of Edinburgh. I guess the driving forces for doing this was to try and make more use of the richness of data from crop models, and to really think about land use intensification versus expansion of agricultural land in a richer and more spatially specific manner. And as part of that is to look at the role of adaptation as well as other drivers for land use change. So I'm not going to spend too long talking through the sort of the spider diagram of all the components in this model because I don't have the time. But we're looking at projecting food demand and then thinking about how that plays through to international trade, as well as obviously the actual land use decisions for what crops are grown where. But to give you some flavour of how the model works, I want to talk about in a little bit more detail about sort of one of the key aspects. So on the left-hand side, you can see sort of maps which are sort of potential crop use potential crop yields for a particular crop. So we're doing this factorial experiment within the crop model. So thinking about under different management intensities, different ranges of fertilization rates and irrigation rates, what crops, what yield could we achieve for a particular crop. So we do this. So as I say, as a factorial experiment for every time step, for each climate, for each crop, and for each combination of fertilizer and irrigation. And then for each grid cell, moving to the right-hand side, for each grid cell, we sort of stretch this yield response surface over those factorial points. So this is for a particular grid cell, a half-degree resolution. We have some data from the crop model about how much yield we could achieve at different levels of fertilization and irrigation. So on the z-axis we have the yield, and the x and y-axis we have irrigation and fertilization rate. And then the model's trying to decide, well, if I'm going to plant this crop in this location, what level of intensity should I apply? So in this particular grid cell, we've got a fairly strong response both to irrigation and fertilization. So if we were going to grow maize in California, which this grid cell relates to, then we'd be likely to apply some irrigation and some fertilization, sort of as indicated by that little blue X. Whereas to take this alternative grid cell, which is in East Anglia, there's not much response to irrigation water, but there is still a strong response to fertilization. So if we were going to choose to grow spring wheat in this location, we'd likely apply fertilizer, but we might not use any irrigation water. So that's the sort of the broad dynamic. So we're doing this spatially. We've got quite a bit of data about different crop yields and under different management intensities or different intensities. So we're kind of fairly traditional. We have to, in this conference, talk about SSPs and RCPs. So we were looking to model the different SSPs, and we sort of used a Monte Carlo approach to sample an associated RCP. And we also use Monte Carlo to sample other parameters to consider uncertainty as well. And then we have this sort of plot here, which shows fairly typical, if you like, outcomes from sort of cropland areas to the rate, global aggregate rate of nitrogen and irrigation water applied, which would be that one, under the different SSPs. I'm not going to talk through that in great detail because I want to get to the next part of this talk and leave myself some time. So we have the maps again under different SSPs and RCP combinations in this particular instance, showing expansion of agricultural land at 2100. And again, we see this fairly common, if you like, expansion of agricultural land in the tropics in particular. Right, so that's give you some brief flavour of the presentation, but I wanted to get on to something that wasn't necessarily in the abstract at the time, but using this model to think about what's happening globally to the food system and food security as a result of the Russia and Ukraine war. So you can't but help to have come across the fact, if you like, that 30%, roughly speaking, of wheat production, should I say wheat exports globally is from Russia and Ukraine. Also because of higher energy prices, higher gas prices in particular, fertilizer costs have been going up very substantially. So to take that kind of those questions implied by that and think about some scenarios to explore that within the model, we have this, again, fairly traditional 2x2 matrix of scenarios. So starting off from the no-shock scenario, which is, if you like, a counterfactual at this point, where sort of early 2021 conditions in terms of fertilizer prices and international trade restrictions continued into the future. And then moving to the right, we think we're going to impose some restrictions on exports from Russia and Ukraine at some sampled rate between 100 and 50%. And then moving up, we have the energy price shock, where fertilizer becomes tripled in cost, and we have some also increasing costs for transport and machinery effectively. And that gives us the sort of the red scenario, which contains both these export restriction shocks and the energy price shocks. We're going to run those scenarios through the Lansing model. And when we do that, we find, as you might expect, that food prices rise. So we have fairly small, but up in the top left-hand corner, charts of different food commodities represented in the model and how those prices are affected by those shocks. And the furthest left-hand one is basically just the export restrictions, and there isn't a great deal of difference. The sort of rise in prices is sort of the order of 5% globally on the global markets. Whereas in terms of just the energy price shocks, it's a very dramatic change of sort of 80 to 100% that varies between different commodities. And the energy and export restriction shock has a slightly bigger impact. But those increases in price for that sort of last combined scenario, we can then look at how that impacts how those changes in food consumption, how they impact nutritional and health outcomes, and that's what's shown in the sort of the main figure in this slide. So here we're able to sort of project avoided, if you like, additional and avoided deaths. And the higher food prices lead to lower rates of obesity and lower rates of people being overweight, and also reduce the amount of red meat consumed. And so that has these sort of red bars to the left-hand side, which indicate fewer people dying. But unfortunately, it has negative consequences as well. We have less consumption of fruit and vegetables, and we have more people who are underweight, and therefore we end up with higher deaths, particularly in this case in sub-Saharan Africa, where the blue bar is indicating malnourishment effectively. And this, in aggregate terms, kind of globally, this is indicating sort of a range between sort of 400,000 and 1 million people dying as a consequence for those kind of combined scenario of export restrictions and the energy price shock. Now, I suppose if we think about the framing, that may come as a surprise that the export restrictions weren't a bigger part. You know, like this is a direct quote from the BBC saying Russia and Ukraine produce 30% of global supply of wheat, and I more or less misspoke that at the beginning, giving the introduction as well. So we have kind of this in the back of our mind that Russia and Ukraine are such a big dominant player within the global food system. So why aren't we getting why isn't the model responding more substantially than I just showed? And I'm even seeing some nods, right? And I think there's 3 reasons I'm giving here, right? So the first reason is that most wheat is not traded internationally. Most wheat is produced and consumed domestically within that country, roughly 3/4 of wheat, in fact. So actually, if we think about the rest of the world's supply, Russia and Ukraine are only supplying less than 8% of the wheat for the rest of the world. So that's already, dividing it by 1/4 or to 1/4. And then also if we think about other commodities, even other cereals, in terms of other cereals, it's less than 4%. But also we have stocks of staples. That's one of the reasons why they're staples. They're easy to store. And indeed, the rest of the world has stocks that would buffer the loss of wheat for approximately 5 years. So again, you can see that perhaps it's maybe not quite as dramatic as sometimes portrayed. And lastly, substitution. So people can choose to eat different commodities, and that will spread out the load across the whole food system. But also a lot of wheat is used for livestock feed, and again, that's relatively easy to substitute for other cereals potentially, as well as the biofuels usage. So we can, there's stocks, substitution, and the role of domestic production and consumption. But going back to the results for a second, now I've hopefully tried to explain why they are the way they are. We can also look at the environmental outcomes for these shocks. And this again is showing a similar format to the slide I showed earlier, but looking at these sort of Russia and Ukraine related shocks. And if we start in the bottom left-hand corner with fertilizer, we can see the higher cost of fertilizer unsurprisingly leads to a dramatic reduction in fertilizer usage, and other factors of production respond to somewhat fill that gap. So we have more cropland area in aggregate, we have more irrigation water use, and the area of natural and forestry land decreases to provide, if you like, that area of extra cropland. We can also see the same sort of changes here in terms of maps, where up at top we can see the expansion of agricultural area, which is again slightly some in the US, lots in the tropics, and management intensity changes. Obviously, because Russia and Ukraine in these scenarios are not able to export, they reduce their level of intensity, both in terms of management intensity, mechanization, and so forth, fertilizer use and irrigation use, and other countries increase their management intensity and irrigation use to try and make up for that change in production, and also to compensate for the fertilizer use. Fertilizer largely decreases everywhere. So yeah, that's pretty quick run through, but in terms of the conclusions related to the Russia and Ukraine thing, the disruption of food supply from Russia and Ukraine is not such a major driver for the increase in food prices as is typically portrayed, but fertilizer prices is extremely dramatic. And that increase in food prices will have drastic consequences for the poorest in society globally. This analysis suggests 100 million people becoming underweight, malnourished, from those changes, and up to 1 million people all dying, in addition to what we might have otherwise seen, as well as environmental consequences and potential loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions associated with that as well. More generally and more sort of specific to the session, this is an example, Lansing is an example of looking at environmental and human interactions, and yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, we have a question here. So we'll just wait for the microphone.
Yes, thank you. Stefan Fronzek from the Finnish Environment Institute. A very quick question of understanding, and you probably said it, but for how long have you imposed the shock? How long is the war going to continue?
Right. So yes, that's a very good question. So I didn't use the word spike. So to me, forever, effectively, they're imposed and then they don't get removed. Whether you consider that a shock is slightly semantic. It's certainly not a spike. It's a sort of step function.
Okay, Ben, we'll take yours at the end. So I'm just going to move on to the final presentation. So we have Alan Di Vittorio from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and hopefully this will. Right, I don't have the. He's going to start it. Okay, perfect.
To talk to you about the role of coupled human environment modeling in scenario development. I'm going to start with a brief review of scenario-based modeling and then give an example of human earth feedback modeling. I'll talk a little bit about the current state of research in this field, and I'll give a brief update on the project I'm currently working on to couple human and earth system model. So the current state of scenario-based modeling you may be quite familiar with. It's been used for many years in CMIP, and it starts with the integrated assessment models that generate land use and emission scenarios, which are then passed to the Earth system models, which project the Earth system and climate, the outcomes of which are then used to estimate and evaluate impacts in particular sectors. And you can see this is a very linear process. But in most cases, people respond to things as they happen. So there are impacts on agriculture, vegetation, or there are extreme events, or there are limitations in water or other resource availability. the human systems will respond and adapt. And so you have land use adaptation through geographic shifts at other means. You have shifts in energy supply and demand, technological advancements to deal with resource limitations. What that means is the impacts and adaptation all become part of the scenario. And so what we want to do in modeling is try to represent this feedback loop so that we can make better projections of the system in the future as it evolves. So this example of human Earth modeling is based on the Integrated Earth System Model, and that's a coupling of the Community Earth System Model, or CSM, with the Global Change Analysis Model, or GCAM. And what we did was we fed back terrestrial productivity parameters from the Earth System Model to GCAM. And what that did was it directly changed the scenario. So the plots on the right, you can see, are the differences between simulations with human Earth feedbacks minus those without human Earth feedbacks. So the land use scenario is dramatically altered, and that then has downstream effects, including changes in crop prices. And then some more indirect effects in the scenario development have to do with how carbon stocks change on the landscape, because those carbon stocks then further influence the land use scenario as it moves forward. So further research that we've done on this show how much these feedbacks affect carbon and temperature. So we have two scenarios in this case, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. The top panel shows the change in annual land carbon uptake, again with human Earth feedbacks minus without. And the bottom panel shows the change in local surface temperature. And the important thing to note here is not just that the value changes are considerable, but that there's spatial heterogeneity. So there are regionally specific responses to introducing human Earth feedbacks into the system. We've also done a C4 MIP-like experiment where we examine the effect of introducing human Earth feedbacks on land carbon feedbacks. Land carbon feedbacks being how much climate influences land carbon and how much CO2 concentration influences land carbon as things change. And so the plot on the left, you can see that both climate and CO2 concentration are independently affected by introducing human Earth feedbacks, and the effects are even larger when you combine them. And this is with respect to terrestrial carbon storage and crop area change. But then also on the right, we show a considerable impact on what are called the land carbon feedback parameters. So the x-axis is the beta parameter, it's a CO2 concentration parameter, and the y-axis is the gamma parameter, which is the climate parameter. And when we introduce human Earth feedbacks, here shown with the red dots, they're definitely different than the parameter values without human Earth feedbacks. So that's one example of modeling human Earth feedbacks, and there are not many. This paper on the top left is probably the first exercise that was reported, and that was maybe a decade ago. And the rest of these papers are more recent. They're all within the last 5 years. And they've focused mostly on framework development or reviews of human Earth interactions and potential feedbacks, or calling out human Earth feedbacks as necessary to address the grand challenge of climate and land change. And so the point here is that there isn't a lot of research. A lot of it's preparatory, and that it's a young and growing field, which makes it an exciting field to work in. So to help facilitate this, there are a couple of new professional organizations that have started. I remember both of these. One is the Open Modeling Foundation, which is a consortium of researchers who are interested in developing standards for coupling human and Earth system models. And what that means really is developing type of standard interfaces that people can include in either their human sector models or their environmental models, such that others can easily couple those together to do human Earth interaction studies. This other group posted here is the AIMS Working Group on Modeling Earth System and Human Interactions, or MESH. And last summer we hosted a workshop at the Aspen Global Change Institute to discuss this. We invited a wide range of people from a wide range of interests and fields, and had very interesting discussion. I'd like to share with you some of the highlights of that workshop. The consensus was that feedbacks are important but not well understood. Even though some sectors may have a pretty good understanding of impacts, there are others that are of great interest, like bioenergy or extremes, where we don't. But in any case, the feedbacks are not well understood. There was some discussion about uncertainty, because for one, humans are fairly unpredictable. Excuse me. And as we introduce feedbacks in the system, our models get more complex. And so that introduces more uncertainty. And also, these models have different types of uncertainty, and they're characterized in different ways. And so when we couple them together, we can have interesting interactions between those uncertainties and how they propagate. So it's really critical to pay attention and address uncertainty as we go through this process. So more directly related to this conference, there was a lot of discussion about how scenarios need expansion, that climate targets are not the only thing in the world. We need to incorporate sustainable development goals. We need to incorporate biodiversity targets and really focus on defining the pathways more than just the conditions for the pathways. People would like to see the feedbacks included in the scenarios, and that's a lot of what human Earth feedback modeling can do. There was discussion about shocks and disruptions and how they're of interest, but we may not have the modeling capacity to deal with these, but we should be thinking about it. People also want more scenarios, and overarching, people want better communication of scenarios in terms of what they are, what they mean, and how to use them. Some more highlights include critical development needs, which span all types of models and include extremes, human behavior and health, policy conditions and response, and particular discussion in this context about model diversity, which is important for characterizing uncertainty, but also different feedback approaches. So the IIASA is a very complex model, highly resource intensive, takes a long time to run, but it's not the best place to figure out which feedbacks are most important. So we also need less resource intensive models to help us do that. It's also a main point in all scenario modeling, not just with feedbacks, is that we must reduce inconsistencies across models, because there are quite a few, not just in land use and uncovered information, but practices are implemented differently in different models, whether agricultural, forestry, vegetation, and fire dynamics can be implemented very differently. And a lot of this comes down to differences in baselines and definitions. For example, a forest in one model isn't the same as a forest in another model. All these models are also at different scales, and we're not necessarily going to make them all at the same scale, but we need appropriate ways to resolve those scales when we couple the models. So I'm working on a project right now where we're trying to address some of these issues, and one of the things that we're doing is we're taking our human component and we're making it a direct component of the energy exascalar system model, or E3SM. And this is a follow-on project to the integrated system model. And what it will do is it'll help facilitate advancement, because the coupling infrastructure is now standardized with the rest of the model, the rest of their system model. And so there's standard coupling infrastructure. We don't have to redevelop that every time we want to advance the model. If any component is advanced, that component's code can be updated and brought back into the system. Whereas with the integrated Earth system model, it was a very rigid structure. We were using the existing file inputs for scenarios of the components. The human component was called directly from the land. We would basically have to rewrite that whole thing in order to advance it. The E3SM energy cram model is now pretty far along. We have successfully completed the land feedback coupling that existed through the coupler, which is this upper loop, but we still have to complete the passing of CO2 emissions. However, I think this is a good example of the new system in action, because the atmosphere model has changed since we started. And so we don't have to redo the coupling infrastructure, because we're using the standard coupling infrastructure. We just have to update the atmosphere model code, and that's what we're currently doing. And once that's done, we'll just put in our new variables that we want to pass the atmosphere, and it will work. I'm going to briefly go through this land loop since I have a little bit of time, to show how complicated it can be. The GCAM model, again, is the one that creates the scenario, but it is on an unstructured grid, and it runs at 5-year, 1-year time steps. And so it needs to be downscaled to a grid that the global land use model can use to generate land use harmonization format data. And you may be familiar with that from CMIP. That data then goes through some more software that does land type translation, and it does some land service file type processing to get it into the grid format that the coupler wants. So there are 3 different grids, and there are a couple different land type formats that all have to be transformed across before the land can get the scenario. The land can do its work, do the terrestrial productivity, send it back through the coupler, and then again, that information has to be transformed so that you can use it, both in terms of its grid, the land types, and also the type of information GCAM needs to implement the feedback. So it's very complicated, but it's working well right now, and we're really excited to soon get the missions completed so that we can start doing testing in production runs and doing some experiments. And that's where we're at. So just to summarize, feedbacks do matter. We're still at the stage of trying to understand which ones are the most important, which ones we need to prioritize and implement, and different ways of doing that. This coupled Earth modeling is really key to understanding the evolution of the system and the coevolution of both human and Earth systems. It's a young field of research. It needs more model development. It needs multiple approaches. As we get going in this, it really facilitates the needed scenario expansion. In particular, it is how we get the understanding of feedbacks and the evolution of the scenario as the Earth is changing. In part of this, there's also a call to reduce the inconsistencies across models just to improve the accuracy. And I showed you this example, the E3SIM GCAM, that I'm working on right now, where we're really trying to develop a system that's more easily upgraded in the future by being able to add feedbacks between the human system and other components more directly and easily. Thank you for your attention.
So now we have 10 to 15 minutes for discussion. I'm really hoping that Kaoru and Alan are able to join us. I know they are online at the moment. I'm not sure if the technology will allow us. If you do have specific questions for Kaoru or Alan, and they're not able to join them, please do post them on the scenarios forum session 42 page. But other than that, then the floor is open to all of the speakers, and I'm very happy to sort of facilitate discussion. I know Ben, you were very keen to say something.
So to Kaoru and Alan, it's really great to see these efforts moving forward. The conceptual layout which was presented in both of the talks sort of makes sense for a baseline scenario. I'd be interested to think about if you had a strategy for how you'd solve for a particular climate target in this coupled system, and without when an iterative approach is probably off the table.
Yes, we can hear you.
Do you want to answer, Kaoru, or should I start?
Okay. Yeah. So, firstly, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I'm thinking of firstly doing the evaluation of or estimate of how big the interaction is between the human and the Earth system. So after that, yeah, we can go on to the scenario development. So yeah, in this stage, I am now concentrating on estimating how big the human and the Earth system interaction is. It's my opinion. How about Aram?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's interesting. We had a discussion just last week in our group about this very topic. In particular, the way our system works is that we have the GCAM runs in its iterative mode to develop the target response, and in particular the carbon price path. And then we run the model given that carbon price path that was estimated using a climate emulator, specifically Hector in this case. And that's how we run the feedbacks with a particular scenario. Now, we may not get the exact radiative forcing out of it, but it'll be close. In terms of moving forward, we did talk about how we could actually run GCAM with Hector in the iterative mode in line. And so it's a matter of adding an additional model into the system. It's not impossible. It would take us some more work, but we now have the capacity to easily add the radiative forcing estimates back through the system to do that. The other option I was thinking of is some kind of even in simpler emulator where we'd have to run it offline to find out what could be the potential changes in price based on the changes in the radiative forcing that we need as we're running the coupled system. So it's another step, but we're thinking about how to move forward on that.
Thanks. I had a question for the second speaker, Saibal, about the food, the feedbacks within that in society. I was wondering about. I mean, it might sound a bit silly, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. There's the idea that, in America, for example, there was a lot of kind of pushback against these kind of, moves to reduce meat consumption. I think Trump at a rally being like, "Oh, they're coming to take your burgers," this kind of stuff. And maybe that's a small factor. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, or maybe like this kind of reaction to some of these changes is another feedback that needs to be incorporated. But maybe there's a broader, slightly more sensible question within that about like how do you systematically choose the set of feedbacks that you can incorporate, and how do you kind of decide which ones are relevant or not, and how do you kind of quantify that? Just I wonder if you had any thoughts on that process. Thank you.
No, because online they cannot hear you otherwise. For the recording.
Okay, thank you. I think I could ask this question: how do we choose which feedbacks between human and Earth systems are important and which ones should be prioritized? So I think this is a general research question that we all need to answer. For my specific case, and specifically for the dietary change scenarios, dietary change model, the feedback loops emerge from the theories of environmental psychology. They are used to explain individual behavior change, and then we derive how they are dependent on Earth systems, such as the climate risk perception. So in that case, yes, it was an understanding of the existing literature and theories about how behavior change occurs, identifying these feedback loops and putting them in the model. So, but I think if we look at the general case for social systems, yes, we would need more social science to understand the social science research and the existing theories to be able to model this. And for the human Earth feedbacks in general, I guess we need a good review, and I'm also happy to learn about it more. And specifically, if you wonder, these environmental psychology theories, just to name them, one of them is called protection motivation theory. The other one is the theory of plant behavior.
I have a follow-up question regarding that, Sybil. So you say you used environmental psychology and behavior theory. And so I was just slightly surprised to see that in the model was integrated something that is relying on the attitude, behavior, and choices framework, simply because the framework has been quite critiqued in the field because it is not exactly how people end up behaving. And so there's been a lot about moving away from ABC to avoid, shift, and improve. And so I was wondering if that is something that you would think of integrating in your work.
I think avoid, shift, and improve is rather to differentiate between different behavior change options, like avoiding, if you don't fly, you avoid it altogether, or you shift to a different transport means. So in that case, reducing meat consumption or choosing a different diet is again a shift or improve. So I didn't consider the dietary change within this conceptualization, but it was rather about understanding the factors behind this, whether it is a shift or improvement in the behavior as the type of pro-environmental action. We looked at the environmental psychology theories behind it. So my understanding at that time, working with an environmental psychologist in the co-authorship team, was that these theories are sufficient to explain. However, if there are improvements in that literature, I'm not an environmental psychologist myself, I'm happy to learn about them. I think the value of this theory of plant behavior, it helps to take the gap between intentions and actions into account, because this is what we often observe. People intend to change their behavior, but at the end, maybe they don't. It helps us to take this distinction between the intentions and real actions into account. And I'm indeed happy to learn more if there are other theories.
Great. Thanks to all the speakers, firstly. What a great session. I had a question for Alan about space in his model. It's a super impressive effort to get that running. I just wondered, because my understanding is that GCAM runs at a water-based scale, and that got me thinking about how water is held by GCAM. And so if you're thinking about human Earth system feedbacks to do with water scarcity, for example, irrigation, how far do you think holding water as a stock at the basin scale is restrictive in terms of your ability to model scarcity? Because obviously within a basin you might have a great deal of heterogeneity in terms of water availability. And how do you handle that kind of thing when you're going through this process of downscaling to a harmonized product and then upscaling again? And perhaps you don't have answers to all of that. I think it's really impressive what you've already achieved.
Yeah, thanks. You're right, I don't have answers to all that. I can say that our next phase of coupling is to bring water feedbacks into the system. And there's been some regional work with these models in the Pacific Northwest of the United States looking at this. And I don't have those results off the top of my head, but I maybe can find some papers and forward them to you if you give me your information. Because what they still, I think, are working on is understanding that storage component of the basins, right? Because there's storage and there's also cross-basin transfer of water. And I think while the GCAM team, some of the stuff they've done with the water management modules in this regional testbed, they haven't quite finished dealing with the storage issue, but they do have some estimates of how to work with this feedback between water availability and its interactions with use and withdrawal, consumption, and how the two interact over time.
So we've had a sort of a question from, we actually have a team of conveners, and Hannah Liddy, who's one of our co-conveners, has sort of raised more of a discussion, particularly if any of the speakers or participants in the audience want to sort of comment on sort of what the role of human Earth system feedbacks could or should be in scenario development. Okay. Everyone wants coffee, I think. So we have got to 4 o'clock. So yes, Sarah. Yeah.
Like all good scientists, I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going to throw another question in. One of the activities that I've been doing with Jonathan Dongas at PIC for the last several years is a thing we call the loops workshops for the co-evolutionary human environment system things. And so very much in every one of today's presentations, I was going, ooh, that's a good loops workshop topic. We're planning the next one in the spring. It's supposed to be in the autumn, but there's the tipping points workshop happening now. So I recommend the tipping points workshop too. Any of you who want to take this co-evolutionary idea forward, because feedbacks don't just spin in the intended direction, they stabilize systems too. And we're very interested in the whole thing. So don't talk to me at coffee today, my head's too full, but talk to me before I leave.
Thanks very much. Does anybody want to comment on either the question or the response from Sarah, or shall we all go and get coffee and get thinking about it, let it digest, take some caffeine in, maybe have a nice sleep this evening, and perhaps we can all go away and do some excellent research. And I'd like to thank all the speakers in this session and our co-organising team for excellent talks. And please do also see the online posters too. So thank you all.